Okay, thanks everybody. I think thought-provoking is kind of overdone, so I'm going to keep this boring and dull. So thank you very much for coming. This is great to see everybody here. This is a really highlight moment for all of us at Lux because we get to talk with so many smart people with so many good ideas and really ask a lot of questions. So actually, in my presentation, I will be asking a lot of questions, and I kind of see it as almost like a table of contents for what's arrayed before you and what's out there that we see. So I'll be basically pointing those things out as we talk, and I really encourage you to make connections with the people and the ideas that I'll be talking about. So the far future, that's the theme for today, and I want to start out, as I said, with a question. So what's far for you? What constitutes far in terms of timeline or technology or whatever? How do you think about it? Anybody? Ideas? 5 years plus, that's far, okay. 30 years? Flying cars, robots, laser sharks. I'm not going to continue until somebody answers my question, so you might as well wake up. Also, I've been told I have to end on time, which is, I didn't know I had a time to keep. So fast, what else? Technology, Chris Manthaus, what's going on? Far future. Okay, new means of transportation. What types of transportation? What types of technologies? All right, clearly it is my job to tell you about far, but I know in your heads, you have ideas about what far is. So, we usually think of it, I mean, I'm a very spatial person. I think of it as actually being off in the distance somewhere. That's far for me in terms of time. For a lot of companies, what far means is off in the future, in the distance. That means I'm innovative. So companies try and tell a story about how innovative they are by using the far future as a prop, if you will. So this is an ad from 1969, an RCA television called the 2000. And it was called the 2000 because they made 2,000 of them. They cost $2,000. And according to the ad anyway, this was the television of the year 2000. So it's a pretty bold 30 years ahead of time statement. And it really reflects a lot of the hopes and dreams of the future back then. So I know you can't read the fine print, so I'll read it for you. So it starts out, most changes are made gradually, a little here, a little there. But in one giant leap, we've unveiled a new century in color television. So one giant leap was kind of a hot phrase at the time. Neil Armstrong had just walked on the moon. So they played into that a little bit. And building again on spaceships. It sits like a silent spaceship, a huge silent spaceship, I would add. It's sculpted whiteness curving to a rosewood veneer top. Nothing says the future like the rosewood veneer top. It's got a 23-inch diagonal screen, which I think is what the new Samsung Galaxy has. I'm not sure, right? So things were different in the 60s. It was computer designed, and you'll notice, how many of you thought computers when you thought about the future? It doesn't occur, or TV, that's not part of our future picture anymore, but in the 60s and 70s, computers, we've eliminated the conventional VHF tuner in its place into computer-like memory circuits, electronic circuits with memories. They couldn't stop talking about how computers were involved in this process because that was part of the future. And as we all think today, it's really part of our past or part of our sort of detritus that surrounds us all the time. So it wraps up saying, imagine, once for $2,000, all you got was a trip around the world. Also dating this ad a little bit. Now you can travel to a whole new century. So it was, again, just really optimistic, forward-looking, visionary ad in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, RCA didn't live to see this come to fruition. So RCA kicked the bucket in 1986, largely because of its inability to get on to the next generation of display technology. So if you want to know what an actual, $2,000 then is about $12,000 now. So what an actual $12,000 TV looks like now is this. So this is LG's actual $12,000 television today. It's a 55-inch diagonal screen. You couldn't do that with a CRT. It's 4 millimeters thick. You also couldn't do that with a CRT. And it's one of the first commercially, or I think it is the first commercially available OLED television on the market. So I don't think RCA could have foreseen this, even though they were the inventors of this technology. There's a lot of other display innovations going on too. There's a 110-inch diagonal television. That's almost 3 meters. There's a new resolution format called 4K. So these are all kind of the early cutting edge, bleeding edge of television technology. So I was thinking about all these waves of innovation in displays. So from CRTs to LCDs, which also RCA invented, LEDs. Now we're talking about printed electronics. I was just at a Smart Textiles conference last week and have very coarse but cool displays that are made, textile-based. People talk about amorphous computing. So, in the future we'll have a jar of computers and you'll sort of pour it out and you'll cover the table, and your display dots will self-organize, and the battery dots will go someplace else and it'll kind of power itself. And I hope if Apple does this, by the way, that they call it applesauce. Would be great, and I've trademarked the name. Okay, so, which got me thinking about the Higgs boson, right? I mean, that's the first thing you think about, waves, Higgs boson. Okay, who knows what the Higgs boson is? And I insist on a good answer this time. Higgs boson. It's the God particle. There you go. Why is it the God particle? Come on, there's at least 10 physicists in this room. Yes, sir.
It's supposed to explain how particles have been mass.
It explains, right, it explains how particles get mass. It's the, yes. What else? Why is it so newsworthy? I know you know the answer. Okay. In the future, people won't be so lazy when they're at presentations. The reason it's so important is because it completes the standard model. So the standard model is our best picture of the subatomic world. It's got all the quarks and electrons and the little pieces of the universe that make everything that we see around us. And all of those particles had been detected at some point in the past, except for the Higgs boson. So finally, this dotted line here, the Higgs boson, by actually detecting this thing that we knew was there, it sort of confirmed that our picture of the universe was complete. And that's good because it's a phenomenally accurate model, at least in theory, for predicting new things that we haven't seen before. So having that confirmation was good in a lot of ways. The confirmation of the existence of the Higgs, as the Lawrence Livermore National Lab said, this ultimately tells us something about the evolution of the universe and might lead towards a grand unified theory. Well, what's a grand unified theory? I'm not going to bother asking you people anymore. Okay? So the grand unified theory is the unity of 400 years almost of physics. So from light, magnetism, electricity, things that people didn't initially see as one phenomenon were unified. That was unified with subatomic forces, and so on and so on. Until today, we have this grand unified theory that integrates all of these aspects of quantum mechanics that we didn't have one single theory for before. And it's very, very predictive. So how does this relate to the televisions? Well, what I was thinking is, wouldn't it be great if we could take all this mishmash of ideas around innovation and have a grand unified theory of innovation? So, the Innovators Dilemma, technology diffusion, creative destruction, all these ideas we kind of bandy about, but we don't really think of as being aspects of the same thing. They're like, well, maybe they're in conflict, maybe they don't tell us the same thing, but it would be great if we could actually unify these things. Now, in order to keep on time, I am going to go pretty quickly through this, but I've given you a little help. So on just about everybody's table somewhere, there should be a handout. You can follow in your hymnal, take notes, things like that. And I will refer to diagrams that are here, but they're in more detail here than on the screen. Okay? So let's start out with the Ur theory in economics, capitalism, and entrepreneurship, and see if that'll tell us, get us on a road to a grand unified theory. So Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, was one of the first people to look at entrepreneurship and its role in capitalism. Now, some of his early work, I will read for you here, is a theory of economic development in 1934. He said, and I'm going to have to turn this, well, I can read it this way. So economies stay in circular flow, which, excluding any innovations in innovative activities, leads to a stationary state. That stationary state is described by Walrasian equilibrium, which of course we're all familiar with. Economies follow 4 main wave cycles. There's the Kondratiev, the 54-year, the Kuznets 18-year juggler, and so on. These cycles can be added up, just like waves, again, a little quantum mechanics here, to form a composite waveform. So for Kondratiev, it can be 3 lower Kuznets waves and so on. And that, if those are in phase, those waves, it's like, the waves in phase, you get a downward cycle altogether, that's a depression. And so, the fact that the entrepreneur disturbs this equilibrium, it's the prime cause of economic development. You look at this theory and, I don't know, this doesn't even make any sense. This is not even wrong to say, Wolfgang Pauli's famous phrase. This is ridiculous. And if this was what Joseph Schumpeter had stopped with, we would have never, ever heard of him, right? This is a stupid idea. It doesn't make any sense. But what he did note is what I've highlighted in red here, is that excluding any innovations and innovative activities, and those are never excluded, right? The entrepreneur disturbs the equilibrium. It's the prime cause of economic development. Well, at some point, the economists lost their envy of physics, and they got onto real things and started saying things like this. The process of industrial mutation, if I'm using that biological term, there's still some hard science envy going on, incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure. And that process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. So this one phrase is really the only reason we remember this guy and really lionize him. He said one thing, creative destruction. And so the thing that he noticed, sort of from the pristine, alchemical theory of economics, that he noticed that was a little bit of a bug in the ointment was innovations and entrepreneurs. They disturb this economic equilibrium, which in fact has never existed. So that's his lasting contribution, was that observation. Now, from there, we get into a more modern study of markets and things that you will recognize. So that innovation, that little spark, starts a new cycle that follows what? Well, we call it an S-curve. So everybody, you now have to raise your hand if you know what an S-curve is. All right, great. So the S-curve is basically a map showing the market penetration of a product over time. Now, that was actually initially discovered by a sociologist named Tarde, a French sociologist, who looked at innovation and imitation as the two prime forces driving a market. So you have an innovator, and then everybody else who imitates that innovator. And as that imitation spreads throughout a group, that's follows this S-curve. Now, there were two American scientists studying the adoption of hybrid seed corn in Iowa in the early part of the 20th century, and they noticed that actually that buying was preceded by awareness. So we now had a predictive model. If you could measure awareness here, sorry, I don't have a laser pointer, you could then predict when the adoption was going to happen. So you had a little bit of a forward look into the future by measuring one thing that would tell you about the next. They also, just so you know, you've probably seen this bell curve with the innovators, early adopters, early majority, and so on. That's just the S-curve, but showing the number of new adopters at any given point, or the cumulative adoption over time, or sorry, the rate of adoption over time. So, make sense so far? All right, there are 4 of these. Okay, the next one is this. It's that bell curve. So one of their students, a guy named Ev Rogers, looked at this. His dad, by the way, had been one of the Iowa hybrid seed corn farmers who didn't adopt very early. His dad was a laggard, and that bothered him. And he looked basically at this gap between awareness and adoption. A short lag, in other words, I just found out about it, and I went and bought it. That's an innovator or an early adopter. A long lag, I find out about it, I wait to see how it works out for everybody else, and then I buy it. That's a laggard. Okay? So he basically divided this up into segments. So that was his addition to the model. Now, like a lot of the other things that we're going to see, he got a little bit zealous with the data, and he basically took some statistical things and said, well, innovators are 2.5% of the population, early adopters 13.5%, and of course we know that's ridiculous. That doesn't work that way, but the idea is that these are roughly split according to a standard deviation is a notion we can live with. Now, another thinker in this area looked at how technology was adopted. This is more from Crossing the Chasm in 1991. So what he said is basically between these innovators who are technology enthusiasts and early adopters who are visionaries who want to break through innovation, there's a gap, there's a chasm of trust. They don't believe on the other side of that chasm what the early adopters have done. They basically say, all I want is a predictable improvement, whereas those early people want either a breakthrough or they just actually want to tinker with the technology. So he looked at them as really 2 different markets and talked about the lag between those 2 being adopted. And then basically doing the same thing with the awareness curve that Everett did with the adoption curve. Jackie Fenn, an analyst at Gartner, made what's called the hype cycle. Who's heard of the hype cycle? I guess not as many of you. So the hype cycle basically says a technology is announced. There's all this hype about all the great stuff it's going to do. It ends up on the cover of The Economist. That's sort of your clue that it's at the top of its hype cycle. Okay? Cars that are clean, safe, and drive themselves. This is this week. You can't make this stuff up. Another good one in this vein is the Reviving Extinct Species. This is the National Geographic cover. So it's not, can we revive extinct species? It is, we can, but should we? So definitely getting a little bit ahead of the reality curve with the hype here. So at any rate, these four things, like you can see, they line up perfectly. Mathematically, these are really identical. You're just taking derivatives and integrals of each other and segmenting things. These integrate very, very nicely. So you can basically say from Schumpeter through the market research people, we have a unified theory, right? Okay, so the Innovators Dilemma. Now I know almost everybody here is familiar with the Innovators Dilemma, but I am going to give just a little bit of an intro. So the Innovators Dilemma was this guy, Clayton Christensen, and his idea that technological innovations are either sustaining or disruptive, and this is how that works. The green lines are sustaining technologies, red lines are disruptive. So you've got sort of normal progress due to sustaining technologies on a certain, let's say, CRT technology. A disruptive technological innovation comes along, and initially it can't compete with the incumbent technology because its performance is lower. So the vertical axis here is performance. But over time, it catches up and then surpasses that technology in performance, and that older technology becomes obsolete. One of the things that he did was he looked at the sort of the viable market. So this blue band is the viable market. Below that line, that dotted line, there's no market. You can't sell it. The product just is simply too low functional. It appeals to innovators maybe because they want to see how it works. Above that line, only laggards would adopt it. It's kind of an obsolete old technology. It's not really driving new sales. So you can basically integrate what we were just talking about in this model pretty easily. You take Ev Rogers' model, you turn it on its side, and you stick it over here and make it smaller so you can see it. And there you have it. You've got your innovators, early adopters, your main market, and then your laggards, right? So pretty easy. You've got those integrated, right? Makes sense? Okay. Are you following along on your pages? Okay. This is actually on your handout. So we got that. So the other thing, those green sustaining lines in Christensen's model are basically experience curves. So an experience curve, also sometimes called a learning curve, is based on the observation that the more times you do something, the faster you get at it. It's pretty common sense, right? But in the early part of the 1900s, people started putting numbers to that. So one of the first was a guy named Wright at the US Air Force, and he wrote a paper called Factors Affecting the Cost of Airplanes. He noticed that every time the number of airplanes that they had produced doubled, the cost of labor dropped by about 15%. So when people talk about the slope of an experience curve, that's basically what they're looking at. Different industries, as was discovered in the 60s, had different experience curves. So it was kind of their rate of learning. Was it really fast or was it kind of slow? And so Moore's law, that most people are familiar with too, talks about the number of transistors on a chip doubling every 2 years. It's because they were getting smaller, fabrication methods were getting better, so it's not just a labor cost, but the performance increases at a certain predictable rate. And in 1966, there was BCG actually really popularized this by looking across industries and starting to track this in metrics. And that's what became the green lines of Christensen's Innovators Dilemma sustaining technology. So again, you can just see you've got a line, you put it on a log scale, you flip the axis, and you've pretty much got the same phenomenon going on here. So we can integrate those as well. Agree? Great. All right, so open innovation. Now, this is the most ballyhooed term right now. We all talk about this a lot, and it seems like, how do we work in this, a pretty non-quantitative approach with all these things that we've looked at earlier? Well, it's not as hard as you would think. So, again, disruptive technological innovation. That's the big mystery here, right? How does this happen? This is like, some mystery, and it's like, I don't know. Culture is often called leadership. Witchcraft, people will often say, is the cause. So we don't understand this very well. But what makes a technology disruptive? Why isn't it just an advantage for the inventor? Anybody have an idea? You all get Fs. It's disruptive because it leaves the company. somebody else commercializes it. Otherwise, it would just be like, oh, our great next product, right? But it leaves the boundary of the firm. Where have we heard that term before? The boundary of the firm. That's Chesborough's term. So the funnel, this dotted line, it's a fictional line, is the boundary of the firm. When an innovation leaves that, well, he's only talking about the nice case where we do it on purpose, like with a partnership or licensing or some other type of model where I meant to do that. Okay? When it's just mayhem at the boundary, it just leaves somehow. You know, somebody gets fired, they get laid off, they get mad at their boss. There's piracy. There's all kinds of ways that don't fit into the normal model of business, but they are reality. And this is how it happens. So when the technology crosses the boundary of the firm, that's when it becomes disruptive and not helpful to the inventor. So we can actually unify all these things pretty well. So like I said, the benefit of the standard model is it helps you make predictions about the future. And in our case, we want to extend this model to get some new insights, right? So this is just a nice theoretical model. Again, you've got it on paper. What can we do to make this useful in prediction? So the first thing is we need to get data. So this green line, and throughout the rest of the presentation, green line is sustaining innovation. We need some data to justify, you know, whatever crazy theory we're going to come up with. And there are 5 pieces of data that we need. Okay, the first one is patents. Patents are often the earliest indicator that an innovation is going to happen. This is some data. So this is all, by the way, actual data from a study around display, so it's very relevant to the example I gave earlier. But this patent data is provided by Zacco. This is an intellectual property analysis firm. They are actually here today in the back. Christine and Mikko, can you say hi? Thank you very much. So talk to them. So we are working with them to look at some new ways to analyze IP. And just looking at the patents and filers, we can see that that number peaked. The number of patents, or sorry, the number of filers and the number of filings both peaked in 2006. Okay, so after that, there's certainly some innovation going on, but that tells us that, okay, a lot of the important stuff has been discovered, and there's maybe some tweaks and adjustments, but we can kind of see that that's going to keep on a downward slope if some other innovation doesn't come along. The next thing is the awareness and hype. Now, this was, by the way, this was not derived from first principles. This was by looking at the data. If you look at the hype around flexible electronics and displays specifically, you can kind of see from 2001 to 2005 to 2008 to 2010, basically that was the cycle, the up, the peak of hype, and then the trough, okay? And then by 2012, you saw things like Bridgestone's stopping its work on electronic paper. So a lot of people that rushed into this new field were starting to get out by that time. Okay, so awareness and hype. Who pays attention to awareness and hype? Venture capitalists do. They're like right over the hype. Let's get over to it. So this is, again, actual data from venture investments in the space. I've left the hype cycle up there so you can see how they overlap and coincide. They peaked 1 year later, 2007. Okay? So you can look at the number of investments, who invested in what technologies, things like that. BASF and Samsung actually built really good portfolios in this time, so it's not just silly nonsense. It's actually a lot of good work, an important job of bringing in external technologies into the firm in this case. It's not disruptive, obviously, because these are all planned things. And then you've got the experience curve. So this, again, is our data. We're looking at the different components in a flexible display. So the driver electronics, TFTs, things like that, and seeing how that declines over time. And you can forecast that. And as it starts to flatten out, you're basically getting to the point where this is what this technology is going to be able to do cost-wise. Okay? So from there, you can start making projections about sales, segments, and size. So again, this is just data that I plotted that we had on this curve to show how this unfolds. It wasn't derived from first principles. It's the way, if you want to understand how a sustainable innovation is going to go from idea to market, this is what you need to plot. And then from there, you can pick up with the market things that give you some predictability. Make sense? It's on the back of your handout if you like. All right, so this is data that we have access to, so it's great to use. I should also say that the data here is from our printed flex. My mic is on. Our printed, flexible, and organic electronics practice, led by John Melnick and his team. You guys, can you wave? All right, so talk to John if you're into printed electronics. So looking at how this evolves, like I said, is very, very data-driven, very intuitive. But it still doesn't show us where the disruption happens or why. So there are 3 phenomena I want to point out to you that I hope will help us get into a more predictive mode. And the first is this min-max thing, all right? So we know when this sustaining technology crosses this market line, going in or going out, something happens, right? And that's really driven by the use case. So the minimal viability of a technology is when, okay, you can actually do something with it. One of my favorite examples is electronic football. How many of you played electronic football in the 70s? And yeah, it's a great game, right? It was just as immersive as Madden, NFL, Xbox, whatever. Who needs all those pixels? We had 12 pixels and we loved it, right? We were in there. We were on the field. But with 12 pixels, that's probably the least number of pixels you can use to represent a football game, right? If you had 6 pixels, it wouldn't be so exciting. 12, all right? So 12 is kind of the minimum, right, the entry point. Then you get 30 years later or so, you get the Retina Display. So Apple in 2010 launched the Retina Display. The name of the Retina Display comes from the fact that your retina can't actually resolve pixels that are any smaller. So unless you're designing a game for hawks or some other, really well-sighted animal, you don't need any more pixels ever, ever, ever. So you can make bigger screens, you can do other things with them, but the pixel thing is done, right? It's not coming back. That is basically mature and soon to be, not obsolete, but ubiquitous, cheap technology, okay? So that's how that min-max cycle happens. What happens after that, though, is where the disruption starts to go. So there's some other examples. This isn't just in displays. So from the electronic football to the iPhone in 2010 and handheld displays, you can see a similar progression in molecular diagnostics. So in the 1920s, if you wanted to find out that you were pregnant, I don't know, that you would go to somebody who could cast a spell or read some tea leaves. There was no real good way to know, no definitive way. And then this Asham and Zondek developed what's sometimes called the rabbit test. They would basically inject some fluid from the woman into a rabbit. If she was pregnant, the rabbit's ovaries would swell. You could do this with frogs and mice too, but it got the name the rabbit test. So if you've ever heard the phrase, the rabbit died, that means she's pregnant, that's where it comes from. Okay? So it was 1927, the first definitive molecular test that you could do. By 1976, there was the early pregnancy test. So you could go to Walgreens or CVS, buy a kit, go home, and in the privacy of your own home, find out whether you were pregnant or not. You didn't have to send away samples to a lab and kill an animal and wait a few weeks for an answer. This is kind of the maximum thing. It couldn't be any more convenient, right? I mean, maybe in theory, but that's about as convenient as you need a pregnancy test to be. So that's kind of the end of the line for pregnancy tests, right? Passenger aircraft. The first passenger aircraft that wasn't just like a pilot taking his friend somewhere was the Sikorsky S-22 in 1914. It took 11 passengers, and it had chandeliers and things like that. By 1970, we had the 747. This carries, depending on the configuration, 300-400 people, maybe not 400, but a lot. Okay? And until very recently, the A380 came out. This was the biggest passenger aircraft on the planet. So these technologies reach their endpoint, like I said, with the Retina display. What happens with them? Well, they don't just sit still. People come along, innovators come along and do stuff with them. So what's going on with iPhones now? And smartphones, tablets, they're going into robots. So Romo is a little startup robotics company, so it's Double Robotics. These companies basically say, why should we reinvent a display and a battery and communication infrastructure and all this other stuff? Let's just take the phone and stick it on there, right? That's good enough, done. It's like, we need a transistor. You don't go invent a transistor, you go buy one, and it's just a part. So this thing as a whole becomes a part. With pregnancy tests, well, you didn't just stop, right? They started multiplexing assays. So taking one assay, combining it with a bunch of others that you would, sort of the same type of people would want to take at the same time. Not pregnancy test and baldness, but some things that typically the same types of people would want to know. There's other things like Sony, for example. Not many people buying CDs anymore. So they're making basically microfluidic lab-on-disk devices where they make little wells and paths for reagents to flow through, put those disks in a reader. You've got a laser and an optical sensor, so you can see what's in your sample. So you're finding a completely new use for this obsolete technology. And with passenger aircraft, something that, as Mike said, space travel's cool. Space is so much in the future. Well, there are a bunch of space startups, and one of them is Stratolauncher. This was founded by a Microsoft billionaire named Paul Allen. And they're basically taking parts of 747s to build a gargantuan, you can kind of see from the picture, this is like 2 747s next to each other, first stage lifter. So to take very, very large rockets up to the stratosphere and give them essentially the boost into space that they would otherwise need to get from a very, very large disposable first stage. So very innovative new stuff just by combining the junk that other industries and technologies have kind of cast aside. I recently visited the innovation cluster where the new space community, as it's called, is located. It's in the Mojave Desert at an old military air base, and there's a startup called Xcore that's making something that they hope is going to be this, this reusable ship to take a couple people up into space, not even orbit, but just the tip of space and come back, do some experiments and things like that. But really, have some cheap adventure tourism. So this might be the climbing Everest of the the 2015s or 2020s. It's expensive, like climbing Everest. It's cool, like climbing Everest. It's dangerous, like climbing Everest. So there's at least a there, right? But the more important thing for everybody here, if that's the far future, the near-term thing that they're working on is this. So like the other companies I talked about, they're taking mature technologies from other industries, in this case automotive, and repurposing it for their new innovation. So in this case, they've got a piston pump that came from automotive industry. This is the chief engineer, Dan DeLong. Our pumps are fabricated using readily available automotive manufacturing techniques developed over the past 120 years. This allows us to competitively procure high-quality components while avoiding the overhead of maintaining a specialized industrial base. So this is how innovators think. This is how they work. I need something, I'm going to make it work, and I'm going to start with the stuff I have and not do this long-term, let's see if it ever happens stuff. They start now with what they've got. So fail fast, prototype fast, that's how they do it. This is some actual floating flying robots in the International Space Station. So it's not just hackers that do this. These are powered by Samsung smartphones. Just on the back of the robot, there's a smartphone that does all the stuff that isn't specifically related to flying around and sensing the things it needs to sense. So it's not just a startup thing. So that recombination of mature technologies is the second important principle for looking ahead, where that disruption is going to come from. You take mature technologies from a bunch of other industries and you combine it into one thing that disrupts all those things it left behind. So again, taking the smartphone as an example, because we're all familiar with it, there's lots of other ones. Retina Display, you can't really see any more than that. That's a mature technology. It starts to displace other displays. It's got music storage, it's got battery life, it's got video camera, it's got GPS, it's got all these things that would have been $1 million worth of hardware before these phones integrated it all into one. And you'd be pretty hard pressed to find. I bet as these get better, finding a just pocket digital camera is going to get harder and harder and harder. It's pretty easy to see that that's going to happen, right? Or a GPS. So this principle is really important for how disruption happens. An example that is very, very different, like I said, it's not just smartphones, all kinds of industries do this. So in synthetic biology, we had Jim Collins here yesterday, and he talked about synthetic biology, and he specifically called out this example, the synthetic cell. Researchers say they created a synthetic cell. Well, this is what they did. So this is, again, Craig Venter, one of the hypesters. Again, this is a hype moment. Took a bunch of different specific technologies that you can pick apart from their press release or from their papers that they filed. You can see exactly how they did it. And it's these 5 specific things. Gene sequencing, to learn the genome of the thing that they wanted to recreate. Gene synthesis, watermarking, and assembly technologies, and then insertion technologies. So these things are all not totally mature, but fairly mature, and combining them, they can do something really radically different. So is Klaus from DNA 2.0 here? Okay, didn't, but we do have Jason Kelly from Ginkgo Bioworks, so thank you very much. Jason actually brought some parts. Now the fun starts. So here we have some actual biological parts. I promised to tell Carol Jakes that these are all snake parts, and they're ready to be reassembled in an instant. So don't mess with me, Carol Jakes. Carol Jakes is the marketing manager who checked us all in. She's our director here. These are actual biological parts, just DNA dried down. These are from the iGEM competition. So these are basically, this is an annual student competition with a few, is it up to 1,000 or 2,000 now? 3,000 students from around the world that basically create biological parts to have in sort of a biological Radio Shack and be able to put things together as they need. So you can come up and taste them. They're really good later. And there's my clicker. So anyway, so this process goes across industries, and doing something simple like the simple cell is where the state of the art is today. But by looking at where these sustaining innovations could go, we can predict out in the future where some outlandish stuff like bringing the mammoth back might happen. So that's what we've done. So we looked at a bunch of technologies, really everything that could fall into the category of synthetic biology, and broke it down pretty specifically. So these are roughly 15 different broad areas of a particular type of technology, and then a number, I think about 65 in total, specific subcategories within that. And what we're doing is basically mapping how you can get from things that we know very well on the left-hand side to things like bringing back extinct species, the modern mammoth, on the right. If that were to be possible, what would you need to do? You need to know how to make cells talk with each other. You need to know how to make complex tissues. You need to maybe know some cloning techniques. Those are all different ways to get to even these far future things. And again, we're doing this in a very data-driven way, looking at where are the patents, what IGM teams have done what to make progress on this, if any, which researchers and which labs are working on this. So you can be very, very quantitative, even about really, really speculative stuff. So if this ever comes back, it might look like this. This will be your vacation after you get off your space flight. Go play with the mammoth. This is not as outlandish as it seems. Actually, there have been species like the pure-name ibex that have been brought back, if only for a very short time. We're not really good at this yet. So this will, there's no reason in theory that this couldn't happen in the future. There are actually 14 different programs around the world. Like I said, we're looking at this very quantitatively. 14 different species that people are trying to de-extinct. Okay, so maybe it's not going to happen this year, but in the future, one of those 14 teams or one of the others that join this area might very well do that. A more simple, like I said, you've got the space tourism and then the more simple practical example. Well, the more simple practical example of this right now is this is a biohacker space called BioCurious. BioCurious is just basically a bunch of amateurs or professionals moonlighting that have taken the parts of CD drives, an inkjet cartridge, an Arduino, which is a little microcontroller, and built a cell printer. So it's just like an inkjet printer, except it's printing cells. In this case, over here on the left, you can see it says I Heart BioCurious. They've printed some cells that have the ability to emit light, printed them in a petri dish, and made a little love song to themselves about that. So again, this is the here and now. This is about a year old, this project. So the third principle, when you bring these technologies together, they don't always play well together. They don't always just align. And so the third one I want to tell you about is technology shear. Shear is if you've got two layers and they are moving at different rates. They could be tectonic plates. They could be layers in a laminated part. They can shear off and break. And so if you get two technologies you're trying to make work together and they're evolving at radically different rates, you get this problem. So to me, the most obvious example is your in-car navigation system. Like if you have a built-in navigation system, who has one of those in their car? Oh, come on, Marv, you have it. All right, so if your car is even just a few years old, that navigation system looks like it was, taken from an Atari in the 70s. They're, 4-color graphics, and they kind of move like this and stuff, and they look stupid. So what people do is they take their iPhone or their smartphone or their whatever, and they just stick it in the dashboard. Or they get one of these contraptions with a suction cup. So you have a, $50,000 car with a suction cup device on the windshield. It doesn't look good. And this is an example of technology shear. You've got the navigation systems and the electronics are evolving very rapidly, so it looks obsolete fast, and it is, whereas the car itself is pretty much the same vehicle. So taking that phenomenon and looking at, again, one of these future things, cars that drive themselves. This is a great example of an area that has just caught on fire, I would say, in the last 12 months. Google basically forced them into it. So Google has a car that has about 700,000 kilometers, I believe, on it at this point. It's driven a lot on regular roads, not on some track, off in the desert where it can't hurt anybody. On roads in California, like between Palo Alto and Sunnyvale and Cupertino, right in traffic. Okay, so you get in this car and it drives you where you're going, and it's actually safer than a typical driver as far as they can tell so far. That shocked a lot of people. It shocked a lot of the car makers, especially because they had some people on this. This was a far future technology for them, and Google beat them to it. So how many hundred engineers did Google need to make that happen? Any guesses? How many engineers does Google have on this project? 5? You like Google too much. 30 engineers. So we've got 30 people working on this project to make a car from the 2025s or 2050s today on the roads. So this can happen really, really fast. Steve Jobs, before he died, as he was feeling very sick, he said, if I'd had more energy, I would have taken on Detroit with an Apple car. So I don't think car makers were thinking of getting into handsets and search engines and things like that, but those companies are thinking of getting automotive because they can put a layer, an interface on top of that that basically makes the customer theirs and commoditizes the product beneath it. The same way your handset is often a commodity because the iOS that you use is really what you work with. So If car makers don't get on the bandwagon, Google will definitely be your first autonomous vehicle. Some of the technologies, strategies that we've talked about today, or the last couple of days, like alpha partners and hybrid technologies that my colleagues have mentioned, these are good ways to manage this process or this problem of shear. So sum all this up. You need to gather data along this line of sustaining innovation and then apply these techniques, looking at the min, max, and mix cycle. Look at adjacent products and industries, because that's often where the disruption comes from. If it was in your space, you'd know about it. Could come from another industry into automotive, for example. And then address, find these areas of shear and address them. So last thing, the future of disruption. What happens? How do we disrupt disruption? Well, just like the grand unified theory is not complete. It doesn't incorporate things like gravity and relativity and other phenomena that we know are out there. We just don't really know how they fit with the standard model. There are other theories and ideas that have come up and that will keep coming up that we'll need to integrate into this. And the one thing that's really missing actually goes all the way back to Schumpeter and the innovator. We don't really understand how that works, but we're starting to be able to quantify it. Looking at people, well, Chris Anderson, the former senior editor at Wired, has looked at this phenomenon a lot, and in fact has really become one himself. So he spent a long time at Wired. He's written 3 books, Long Tail, Makers, and Free, which if you're not familiar with, you should be. They look at how the maker movement, if you will, the hacker movement, really changed things like journalism and media, and how the implications for that when they start getting them into physical devices are really important for almost everything that we make. Now, I know that it's easy to get, this is hype cycle right now. This is at the very peak of it. That doesn't mean it's dumb. It just means that right now it's a little bit overvalued. But Chris Anderson actually left Wired, pretty cushy job, and founded a company called DIY Drones. So it's 3D printed flying robots, right? Right. I didn't bring a drone. They're illegal. But he's putting his money where his mouth is and actually making a business out of this. So this focus on the innovators at the nexus of the users and markets, of the technologies and the business models, that's really where the innovation happens. That's the disruption, and that's why it's so hard to detect. It's one individual leaving the company or coming up with an idea and then disrupting something else. That's really hard to pick up if you're not looking where the innovators are. And that's the main point I want to make, that we need to look at the areas where we know innovation is happening in these 3 things: markets, technology, and business. And these are just some of the examples of the areas that we're starting to cover in a light way so you can get a little foresight into what's going on to hacker spaces or future displays, crowdfunding, business models and technologies and markets that are just starting to emerge. We're counting the companies, looking at who the innovators are, and helping you find them early. So one example is the Pebble. Who knows what the Pebble is? Pebble is a watch. Okay, so the Pebble is more than a watch, actually. It's kind of like a smartwatch. It is a display. I actually have one on my wrist right here that was crowdfunded. So that means that they went to a site called Kickstarter, and they said, hey, will you guys not give us equity, give us money, and we'll send you a product. So $150 or $115 or $100, you would actually get a watch when they were made. Well, that campaign took off like crazy. And they ended up getting not $100,000 that they'd asked for, but $10 million. Now, this is striking because they'd only raised at that point $375,000 in venture capital. VCs are like, nah, it doesn't fit our model. It's just something that doesn't fit that old paradigm. So crowdfunding is actually giving VC, let's say it's early days, but could potentially give it a run for its money. Same thing with patents. Well, Apple says they might have a 100-person team on this. They've been talking about how many patents they have in space so that they can scare Samsung, and Samsung's like, no, we've been working on this for a long time. Well, so this is a 25-year-old kid, Eric. I actually talked to them last week, and I said, I need a Pebble now because I'm going to be talking at the Lux Executive Summit, and they delivered it, and here we are. That's the value of these companies, is you can talk with the makers, and the makers want to talk with each other. So the real important thing here is not that this is a great device that might be to the handsets what the handsets were to the dumb phones and to the computer. It's the manufacturing process that led to this. So the company that actually sent the watch is based here in Boston. They're called Dragon Innovation. And basically, if you need an instant supply chain, it's just like the way that if you need to find some software on the web and just download that app, it's like that. They can create that supply chain for you in almost no time. And they got this company, Kickstarter, making 85,000 watches from idea to 85,000 shipped products in 1 year. New product. It's not a prototype. So, so you can do a lot of stuff with this. Another example is Local Motors. So Justin from Local Motors, can you raise your? There's Justin. So Local Motors is an open source, crowd-powered vehicle design and manufacturing company. They actually have made this, I think it looks awesome, car called the Rally Fighter. So this was, I think, 25,000 designers and enthusiasts that got together, designed this vehicle, and they built it at a cost that's just a small fraction of what it takes an OEM to like a Ford or a GM or a Kia or Hyundai to bring a new car to market. So normally you would spend 60 months developing a vehicle. They did it in 18. Normally you'd spend about $1 billion or more. $6 billion is not unheard of to bring a new vehicle to market. They spent $3 million. Okay. They also have a goal of selling 2,000 of these, which most car makers would go, who cares about 2,000 cars? That would be a rounding error. Well, it'd be a good number, but still. For them, that's okay. They don't need to make any more than that. And that's, again, the analogy with bloggers. You don't need to be the New York Times and reach 20,000 people in every city in the world. You just need a small market, and that's what they need. So here are some parts to give you an example. This is a spacer for a side view mirror. So you can think, you're looking at the side, you check your back. So this part costs $20 to make normally. It's a very labor-intensive process, and they replaced it with this part, just 3D printed. It costs $1 to make. Okay, so these are the types of things, even if you don't want that particular vehicle, if you're a car maker, you can learn from these types of design and manufacturing techniques and greatly reduce the cost of the process as you already do. And then another one is CubeSats. So this is a satellite. It's kind of hard to tell from the picture how big the satellite is. This is an actual satellite in space. There are a few dozen like this. And this is sort of the equivalent of a shipping container for a satellite. You have a standard size. Whatever you can put in there that's not dangerous for the rest of the payload, we'll send up into space with you. And the reason this is so much less expensive than a traditional satellite is not because of the just because of the size. These are very small. It's because you can ride on a secondary payload. So a real large-size satellite, you can fit these types of satellites in sort of the nooks and crannies under the nose cone that aren't otherwise occupied, because this is how big it is. Okay, so there are about 34 companies making CubeSats and CubeSat parts. Jeff Kruken, in the back there, sort of a representative for the new space community here today. Talk with him. So these satellites are being developed and launched by high school classes, by the Republic of Colombia, by people that normally wouldn't have a space program. And one of the ways they're doing that is actually by using smartphones. So there are actually 2 smartphone-based satellites on orbit right now that have gone up in the past several months. So again, the point here is not that, do I need a satellite? Although you might. If you're an oil company and you want to monitor your, you've got an oil spill that you need to quickly find out what's going on with that. You want high-res, good images that you don't want to get from NASA, and you need that picture. You can have your own satellite fleet. There's a lot of other ways that this can be used. So the point of this is going back to the innovators. It's the process, right, that's important. So remember back that curve, 2.5% of the people are innovators. Everybody else is an adopter. They just follow those people. Innovators have very, very different reasons for doing things. Most of us want to think technologies are products. Innovators see that as a means of production. Okay, we think of business models as how we buy those products. For innovators, business models are how do I organize myself? How do I fund myself? And whereas most of us want better, they want different. So the whole point is to disrupt stuff. That's why it's so important to go to where these people are and find out what's going on. So as an example, all these manufacturing techniques we've talked about, printed electronics, synthetic biology, 3D printing, and so on, these are things that change the slope of the experience curve. Remember, that's what causes disruption. The faster technology catches up with the incumbent technology and disrupts it, and that's what these technologies promise to do. So sum this all up. We've got market, technical, and business models of innovation, and we can unify them. The scale at which they unify is the scale of the individual innovator. There are specific techniques you can use to forecast innovation and see where it's going. And the innovators, they are the seeds of this disruption. They're that spark that Schumpeter talked about that kicks all this off. So this is a little brief overview of the handout that you've got. If you didn't already notice, you can actually do something with this. You can fold this up, make your own cube out of it, and it actually, I think, works better as a cube. And this is why it's so interesting to unify all these theories, because you can see the basically the market process being a cycle going around the side. You can see the things that unify it on the top and bottom. So as your arts and crafts project, you can get out scissors and tape and do that at home. I'll send you the color version if you want. And the important thing to remember is that far, remember you look at it, you see it off in the distance, and it might seem far away, but for a lot of things, it's actually just that they're small and close up. So don't mistake things that are far away and look big for something that's actually right in front of your nose, because as soon as somebody connects those things, you'll see that it's right there. So thank you very much for your time, and I have time for some questions if you like.